Tonight on Talking Points, last week's Women's March went from coast to coast and even around the world.
Turkish forces invaded Syria as part of Operation Olive Branch. We'll have more on the invasion's significance later.
And I sat down with a professor from the iSchool to discuss changes in Facebook's handling of news sources. This is Talking Points. Good evening, I'm Josh Carney. Our top story tonight, the government shutdown is over.
And I'm Mike Riccardi. The government passed a short-term spending bill that will keep the government open for another 3 weeks. The government shutdown was lifted on Monday after President Trump signed a short-term spending bill. However, the question will be reopened 3 weeks later due to the bill's temporary nature. The government shut down after disputes across the aisle regarding DACA and the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. During the shutdown, a Democrat-led resolution to keep giving the military their benefits failed, leading Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to criticize Senate Democrats.
The Trump administration minimized the effect of the shutdown by keeping national park services open and having agencies draw from the governmental funds. On January 22nd, a bipartisan group of senators created the temporary spending bill reopening the government.
This regrettable episode reminded all of us that in the United States Senate, brinksmanship and hostage-taking simply do not work. The only path to meaningful progress is the hard work of crafting legislation and persuading colleagues on both sides to support it.
The president signed a continuing resolution on Monday, ending the 69-hour government shutdown. But that funding only lasts until February 8th. That means that another shutdown could be on the horizon. Here to talk about what we've learned from that shutdown and what we can expect in 2 weeks is Talking Points analyst Dan Prager. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great for a new year.
So we only have a couple weeks before the government possibly shuts down again. I mean, it took 3 days of a shutdown for, both sides to get their act together and make a deal. What are we expecting this time? Do you think another shutdown is looming, or are they going to come together and make a deal?
You'd like to hope that they can come and make a deal. And for a while, it looked like things were looking up. People were agreeing on things. Bipartisanship was actually working out. But after the fact, after that happened, talks have kind of broken down. You've seen Donald Trump say we're not going to give funding for Dreamers unless we get our funding for the wall. Chuck Schumer has said we're not giving you that funding for the wall because you wouldn't agree with us. So there's a lot of fighting right now, and you really can't tell what's going to happen in politics. It's moving a mile a minute, so you don't really know. But right now it looks pretty bleak.
And even then, you do have some Democrats and Republicans suggesting that Schumer was not serious about that threat of taking away the funding for the wall.
And in terms of that funding question, has DACA become a red line for Democrats when it comes to giving Trump that money?
Democrats would like to hope so, but they also said it was a red line this time around. And when the government shut down, it seemed like Democrats were getting a good amount of the blame. Now, if you looked at polls, Republicans got a little more of the blame, but it really doesn't matter in national polls. It matters what those swing voters think, and it's a really powerful attack ad. You can just imagine next year saying these Democrats cared more about DACA, these illegal immigrants, than funding the military, than funding our government. And so I think the Democrats, if it comes down to another shutdown, if they say it's DACA or nothing, they could kind of get played into another trap. They're going to hope that they can negotiate enough to keep this on the table, but really Republicans seem to have that bargaining power right now.
And obviously, Dan, with both sides playing the blame game, most people would hope that the government does stay open, but a major part of this is, what sort of things can both sides of the aisle get out of these sort of deals? It's not just about keeping the government open. They're fighting for certain things. In this case, when they struck this deal, who do you think took away more, the Democrats or the Republicans? Obviously, both sides are going to claim that they won, but what do you think where does the truth lie?
It's really hard to say because we won't know until really 2018. I would say polls right now are showing the Republicans, specifically President Trump, is taking most of the blame by about 1%. Then you have Democrats in Congress. Then you have Republicans in Congress taking the least amount of blame, although that blame could have been shifted onto President Trump. I will say what we've learned is that there is room for bipartisanship. There is room to work together and make deals, and Congress isn't as divided as we say. They still can work together. But what we've also learned is that it's incredibly tough to do that, and with different factions on each side arguing pretty much everything, you don't really know what's going to happen.
Well, with February 8th on the horizon, we certainly are not going to stop talking about this.
Absolutely.
Thanks for being here.
Thank
Dan.
you.
A series of marches across the country as both sides of the political spectrum made their stances known on controversial issues. We'll have more on those protests after the break.
Leaving hot coals improperly extinguished can cause a wildfire.
Hey guys, it's Smokey!
It looks as if Smokey is going to use the drown, stir, drown and feel technique. After the first drown, a good start. Next, another drink. And finally, a close feel.
Is it cool? Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Smokey, catch! Oh, my bad, Smokey.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
They said a bottle was just a bottle. That no one would ever notice me. But I knew I could be more. That one day, I would make people smile.
While women across the country marched in protest of President Trump's administration, thousands on the other side of the aisle gathered to protest the decision in Roe v. Wade. The so-called March for Life has been held annually since the year after the landmark decision, and advocates for the life and dignity of each human person. This year's march featured various religious leaders, House Speaker Paul Ryan, and President Donald Trump via satellite. Here with more is Talking Points analyst Joey Lino. Joey, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot of the media coverage focused on the Women's March, and this sort of hasn't gained as much prominence. So what is the significance of the March for Life?
Well, the March for Life has been going on for 45 years. It started the year after the decision in Roe v. Wade. Their message is a voice for the voiceless. That's their slogan, and they advocate for human life. They are anti-abortion. It's been going on since the year after, and it's the largest pro-life gathering in the country, and it's just an opportunity for people to come together. It's not exclusively anti-abortion or pro-life. It's also, they talk about end-of-life process, and there's a couple other issues they advocate for.
Now, Joey, a lot of members of this march have said that they feel excluded. They don't feel welcome at the Women's March because of their pro-life stance. Now, when we take a look at the March for Life, what sort of inclusivity do they have there? I mean, are there religious undertones, or is it a welcoming environment?
Well, the March for Life isn't technically a religious event. However, a lot of prominent religious leaders speak there. Churches across the country encourage their members to go. House Speaker Paul Ryan, actually, we have a clip of him that exemplifies this kind of. There are some slight religious undertones. If we can hear what Speaker Ryan had to say?
It actually appears like we don't have that.
We don't have that.
Actually, we do.
We do have that clip.
Churches, you march with your friends, your neighbors.
Well, what he was saying there was that you march with your churches and your friends and your neighbors. It just, there are religious undertones to the march.
Right, and what kind of significance does a Paul Ryan and Donald Trump appearing virtually have for this march?
Well, it definitely makes them feel more like they're being more heard in the political realm. They felt like they've been pushed to the side for 8 years with President Obama in office. There's been a mixed reaction to President Trump's involvement, actually. A lot of people are expected to see a little more done under his presidency for their cause. However, the lack of results has been blamed more on Congress than the president. However, a lot of people are concerned with the many controversies surrounding the president that they don't want him being the face of the pro-life movement.
Joey, thank you so much for covering it for us.
Thanks for having me.
From Los Angeles to New York City, from Washington, D.C. to right here in Syracuse, hundreds of thousands of people took part in the Women's March over the weekend. Activists marched on the one-year anniversary of the inaugural Women's March. Talking Points analyst Galat Malamed is here to discuss the movement and what to expect going forward. Galat, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, what are the major differences between the march this year and last year?
Right, the main issues stayed the same, right to choose, more funding for Planned Parenthood, but really last year it was kind of that immediate response to the resistance of the inauguration of Donald Trump. Now it's the one-year anniversary of his inauguration, the day the march happened, and it kind of showed that these demonstrators are in it for the long haul to the resistance. It's not just they resisted him the day he was inaugurated, it's a real resistance movement throughout his presidency.
Right, and would you say that it has moved beyond that resistance because of the Me Too campaign and all the issues that surround that? How has that kind of influenced the march this year?
Yes, certainly. The Me Too movement played an integral role in this year's march. We definitely saw more signs and more awareness of sexual harassment at the march. Of course, it was there last year, but even more so this year. The New Jersey First Lady, for instance, gave a speech about her own experience with sexual harassment at the New Jersey march. And really, just to show how big of a movement this is in the country, the New York Times, the front page of the New York Times on that day was Allie Raceman's statement at Larry Nassar's sentencing, showing that the Me Too movement is not just in this march, it's really taken over the country.
And what about the march right here in Syracuse? Was that any different?
Yeah, there were over 2,000 people marching downtown, and Colleen Deacon was actually one of the main speakers at that march. Of course, lost the congressional race to John Katko last year, but she was speaking on behalf of Governor Cuomo's office, and again, the message was the same in Syracuse as it was across the rest of the nation.
And in terms of this march going beyond and kind of affecting the political climate, how will the landscape shift after these marches take place?
Yeah, well, as we approach the midterm elections a couple months away, that was one of the big messages at this year's march, was that more women need to get elected in Congress. There was actually Sunday, the day following the Women's March in Las Vegas, there was a Power to the Polls march. It was organized by the founder of the Women's March last year in Washington, trying to get more people elected. And one of the reasons possibly why it was in Las Vegas, Democratic Congresswoman there, Jackie Rosen, running against Dean Heller for his seat in Nevada, a vulnerable Republican seat. We also had Kirsten Gillibrand speaking in Washington about getting more women elected to Congress. Of course, speculation of her making a 2020 presidential run. So really getting women into politics was a big message of this year's march as well.
Certainly a very significant movement that we are going to keep our eyes on here. Thank you so much for reporting that for us. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has a plan for the country's government moving forward, but not everyone agrees with her. We'll have that and more international stories after the break.
There's one thing you can never have sex without.
It's not something you buy.
Or something you take.
In fact, there's only one way to get it.
It has to be given to you, freely.
It's consent.
Because sex without it isn't sex.
It's rape. Consent.
If you don't get it, you don't get it. It's on us to stop sexual assault.
Learn how and take the pledge at itsonus.org.
I see you mobbing over her. Let's go. Let's mob. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, we mobbing. Come on, girl. Let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl. Hey, let's crawl. Hey, yo, let's crawl.
Negotiations are underway in Berlin to form a new coalition government between Chancellor Angela Merkel's center-right Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party. The SPD voted by a narrow margin on Sunday to begin coalition negotiations with Merkel's party, but some members of the SPD are displeased with their party's decision. Here to talk us through what we can expect as negotiations begin are Talking Points analysts Thomas St. Hilaire and Connor White. Guys, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you very much.
Now, how important is it for Angela Merkel to form a coalition government?
Well, really, it's important for a couple of reasons. I mean, the first thing is talks with previous parties back in November failed. So the pressure is really building up on this. It's extremely substantial. But the second thing is this is a real opportunity for Angela Merkel to cement her legacy as a leader in Europe, a legacy that's already quite long and lengthy. Once she can address this issue in Germany, she can start focusing on some other issues throughout Europe, such as Brexit, and then also start focusing on things like, who her successor is, something that she hasn't really done yet.
She needs to get this coalition together in order to ensure that she continues governing, because without it, it's either a minority government, which she has already said that she does not want to do, or she'll have to call a new election.
In getting from minority to that coalition, what obstacles is she going to face along the way?
The main obstacle that she faces is the SPD. The vote to begin talks only cleared by about 56% yes vote. So there's huge divisions within that party. A lot of them are concerned that initial talks sort of water down what they need from the deal. A lot of people in this party don't want to, including a powerful youth movement, which is actually calling for people across Germany to sign up purely to derail this deal.
Well, the other thing, her hand is kind of forced a bit because, again, those deals failed back in November. So this is really her last effort to do this.
In between Angela Merkel and the SPD, going into these discussions, who do you think has more leverage?
It's less of a question of leverage, I think, and actually more of a question of influence and how you can really sway consensus. I mean, we've seen over the last 2 years, ever since really Germany agreed to take over 1 million migrants, that there's been kind of a dwindling of influence that Merkel's been able to have over the consensus. We saw in the elections back in September, it was actually the weakest vote turnout for Merkel's party since Germany, the Federal Union, formed in 1949. So again, she's been struggling a bit to kind of form some of this consensus, and really this coalition government will really be a reflection of that.
Connor, you agree?
I would say that I agree for the most part, but I think that, as you said, she needs to get this done after failed talks in November. So there's a bit of desperation there, and I think that the SPD could play off that to try to get some of their issues to the forefront of negotiations.
And I would say that desperation plays both inside Germany and outside Germany. And when it comes to sort of how this will affect international politics as them being a very strong component of the European Union, how does the European Union sort of go forward in this? What does it mean if the European Union, if they can create this coalition government?
Well, Merkel needs this coalition government in order to stay, as the leader of Germany, as the leader of the European Union within that. We see that Germany has a huge influence not only over Europe, but over, the world as a whole. The euro took a huge dive against the yen back in November when the initial talks failed. So for her to keep her stance as a strong leader and to ensure that Germany continues to lead the European Union going forward, she needs to make this happen.
Just to be clear, it's also really how other countries benefit too. I mean, you've seen Emmanuel Macron in France, who's really trying to push forward some pretty revolutionary economic policies in the European Union.
Absolutely.
Again, with a lot of those Brexit talks.
Thomas and Connor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Turkey's attack on Syrian Kurdish forces this week has the international community wondering how the U.S. will respond to their NATO allies' assault on U.S.-backed Kurds. Here to break it all down is Talking Points contributor Jack Watson. Jack, thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
So what exactly is at stake here for the U.S. and for the region?
So just like with many Middle Eastern issues, there's a lot of conflicting interests here. The Turkish military is invading northwest Syria and attacking Syrian Kurds, the YPG, because of their alleged connection to the PKK, which is a group of Kurds that since 1984, I believe, have been trying to establish an independent an independent Kurdish state within the borders of Turkey.
And what's been the response from the U.S., and what are the chances that we could get involved in the region?
Well, listen for yourself to what Sarah Huckabee Sanders, our press secretary, had to say.
Turkey to exercise restraint in its military actions and rhetoric, ensure that its operations are limited in scope and duration, ensure humanitarian aid continues, and avoid civilian casualties. We want to ensure that Assad's brutal regime cannot return to Afrin, and we will continue working diplomatically to end the Syrian civil war.
So one of the reasons that this hasn't boiled over for the past couple of years is because of the presence of ISIL in Syria. And now that their dwindling numbers, their numbers are dwindling in Syria, it's becoming a lot more of an issue for the U.S. and Turkey, who are now NATO allies, colliding on this issue.
Absolutely, certainly a pressing topic that we're going to keep our eye on. Thank you for reporting on it, Jack.
Coming up, Facebook has given its users some input on what news they gather and how reliable it is. We'll have a Syracuse University professor in after the break to give us more insight. Don't go anywhere.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
Did you hear about the pony with a sore throat? He was a little horse. Can I tell you a cat joke? Just kidding. Why couldn't the Why was the basketball court all wet? Why? Because the players kept dribbling all over it. Where did cats go on vacation? New York.
They'll test you. Try to break your will. But however loud the loudness gets, however many cheese puffs may fly, you're the driver, the one in control. Stand firm. Just wait. And move only when you hear the click that says they're buckled in for the drive. Never give up till they buckle up.
Facebook is taking steps to fight fake news. The social media network is surveying account holders to rank the credibility of news outlets. I sat down with a Syracuse University iSchool professor to discuss the significance of this move. Facebook is ranking news organizations based on their credibility, and ultimately what that means for the platform is something that is still up to discussion. Here to kind of flesh it out for us is iSchool professor Patricia Rossini. Professor Rossini, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we want to jump right into this topic. Ultimately, what does it mean for the platform, the fact that Facebook will be letting users and user feedback kind of synthesize what news outlets, how news outlets are perceived on their platform?
Well, allowing users to rate the credibility is not necessarily a bad move. Facebook has a lot of users, and mostly their algorithms are driven by machine learning, right? So they learn from users, right?
Right.
They probably do have a credible list to start with, but they can't possibly have a comprehensive enough list to say this is good, this is bad news. The way that Facebook is doing this, though, is not necessarily clear. So a BuzzFeed reporter is circulating the survey that they have out, and it's been confirmed that that's the survey that they're using, and they're basically asking users, are you familiar with this outlet, and do you trust this outlet, right? Which it's not necessarily a bad move.
Yeah. And so when it comes to kind of understanding what they want to achieve out of this survey, what is kind of Facebook's objective in understanding kind of what their platform users sort of value?
So what I think they're trying to do with this particular survey is have a list of outlets that are flagged out as not trustworthy, and then check that list against what they also know, right? So instead of going over all the links and all the media outlets that are shared on Facebook, which is a pretty
That's a lot.
large list to go through, they're basically using their users to say, you know, this might be suspicious, this might not be suspicious. So what I assume they're doing is that they're setting a threshold that will flag what is more important. Just so similarly what they do with abuse, right? So algorithms can't really handle abuse that well, but when a user flags this is abusive content, then a human moderator can go and check that out.
Right.
They could be doing a similar move, which is have their users flagging outlets that seem suspicious, and then on those outlets they're gonna work more a bit more. I don't think they're necessarily just gonna delegate to users and whatever user says is true. especially because people could just decide to troll this and say the New York Times is not credible at all.
Exactly.
And Breitbart is super, super credible.
So,
They're not
right, does
considered.
this set a precedent for other social media platforms, such as a Twitter, that now has to go through and kind of understand how people value specific feeds coming out of their platform? You know, what does this ultimately mean moving beyond Facebook for social media and similar platforms?
I think for Twitter is a tad different because the meaningful interactions on Twitter are around information and about information, right? And the other thing with Twitter is that the percentage of the population that is there is not that high, so it's not that problematic. And you do have a very specialized population on Twitter, so you have politicians, you have media, journalists.
But left unchecked, you also have a lot of issues that Twitter has on its own, such as its own harassment issues and, you know, not having as much regulation within that platform. That feed is solely determined by the news that kind of you want to receive or that you would attach yourself to. So is that something that Facebook is kind of going to shift with this move?
No, I don't think so, because the biggest difference between Twitter and Facebook is that on Twitter, your newsfeed, your tweet stream is basically everything that everyone that you share will post, and on Facebook they have algorithms that will filter and prioritize stuff, right? So this is a big difference between these two platforms, because if you say I want to share, I want to follow on Twitter these 5 people because I want to know everything that they post, you're good to go. If you have those same 5 people on Facebook, the likelihood that you're going to see the same content or all the content that they post is really small. You would have to prioritize them, give them a little star and say, I want to see everything that this person posts, which people are unlikely to do so.
Yeah, checking your own feed in that regard. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Professor Rossini, for speaking with us on this topic.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
And right here in New York State, there are some heavy accusations leveled at the office of Governor Andrew Cuomo. Stay with us.
This is the story of a boy who didn't talk for a long time. The boy liked things to always be the same. Any changes would scare and upset him. The unknown was an unfriendly place. The boy was very sensitive to lights and sounds. So he built secret hiding places where they couldn't get in. The boy didn't like looking people in the eye. He wasn't trying to be mean, it just made him feel uncomfortable. Sometimes he would flap his arms again and again.
One day, I found out I have something called autism. My family got me help. Slowly, I found my voice and learned all the ways I could live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org.
2 Syracuse developers and a top aide to Governor Andrew Cuomo are facing bribery charges in an ongoing New York State corruption trial. Prosecutors claim that Joseph Percoco, Cuomo's former executive deputy secretary, extorted bribes from COR Development executives Stephen Aiello and Joseph Girardi, as well as energy company Competitive Power Ventures executive Peter Kelly. Cuomo, who is up for re-election this year, has not been charged.
Well, that's all we have for Talking Points. Make sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CitrusTV News. I'm Josh Carney.
And I'm Mike Riccardi. Stay tuned for a new episode next week. Have a good night, Syracuse, and happy birthday, Mr. Carney.